The hidden history in 2021. Scientists in a New Mexico desert found footprints that shouldn't exist. Pressed into ancient mud beside the tracks of a giant ground sloth, the prints were dated to roughly 21,000 to 23,000 years ago. For nearly a century, the official story said, no humans set foot in the Americas before about 13,000 years ago, when big game hunters supposedly crossed a frozen land bridge from Siberia. And those footprints forced archaeologists to rethink that timeline. So if people were already here 23,000 years ago, who were they? And what did they leave behind? Not scattered wanderers, it turns out, but monumental earthworks built by generations of indigenous labor. A lost city that once rivaled medieval London. And a trade network that moved goods across half a continent centuries before Rome existed. By the end of this film, you'll understand something else too. Why so much of it was pushed to the margins of American history for reasons that were anything but accidental. 6,000 years ago, in what is now Louisiana, people who relied heavily on hunting, fishing, gathering, and long-distance exchange began piling earth into enormous ridges. No wheel, no oxen, just human backs, thousands of workdays, and an idea worth the effort. The site is called Poverty Point, and its concentric earthen rings still align with the solstices, a calendar written into the ground by people once dismissed as too simple to need one. Some of the stone and raw material found there traveled hundreds of miles to reach the site, carried hand to hand along river routes long before anyone thought to call this a civilization. But Poverty Point wasn't the strangest part. It was only the beginning. 1,500 miles north, near modern St. Louis, sits proof that this beginning became something far larger. A place that would have looked, from a distance, less like a village and more like a skyline. At its peak around 1100 AD, Cahokia covered roughly 6 square miles. And some researchers estimate its population rivaled London's at the same moment in history. Its central mound contains an astonishing amount of earth, roughly 14 million cubic feet, carried basket by hand, one load at a time, for generations. Archaeologists have uncovered a wooden solar calendar, nicknamed Woodhenge. Its posts tracking the sun through the seasons, with a precision that still surprises the researchers who study it. Cahokia had a marketplace, suburbs, a skyline of earth rising over the Mississippi floodplain. Within roughly a century and a half, it was largely empty, for reasons still genuinely disputed among the people who study it. But the mystery of why Cahokia emptied is nothing next to the mystery of where its wealth came from in the first place. Trace the artifacts buried in its mounds, and the trail runs strange. Copper hammered from deposits near Lake Superior, over 500 miles to the north. Seashells from the Gulf of Mexico carried the opposite direction entirely. Sheets of mica quarried in the Appalachian Mountains, 700 miles to the east. None of it local. All of it moved across enormous distances without roads, pack animals, or modern transport. Centuries before a single European vessel reached these shores. Someone had to know these distant places existed in the first place and negotiate for the materials and carry them home along rivers and footpaths that left no trace on any map we have today. This wasn't isolation. This was infrastructure. And infrastructure this vast doesn't build itself. It takes power. Somebody was organizing that labor, feeding, housing, and directing thousands of workers over generations, coordinating harvests, construction, and trade on a scale that required real political authority. And some of Cahokia's later burials show evidence researchers interpret as elite sacrifice, a hint of just how sharp and possibly coercive that power had become. Whatever finally unraveled at Cahokia, drought, conflict, political collapse, some mixture scholars are still weighing. It was as much a human failure as an environmental one. The same ambition that raised the city may have helped bring it down. It's a pattern that shows up again and again wherever complex societies rise, including 2,000 miles south, where a civilization was doing something almost nobody expects. Along the coast of modern Peru, 2,000 miles from Cahokia, and thousands of years earlier still, a site called Norte Chico was building monumental architecture around 3200 BCE, the same era as Egypt's earliest pyramids. No pottery, no known depictions of warfare, and strangest of all, it developed without the maize-based agricultural system that supported many later American civilizations. Norte Chico appears to have relied heavily on marine resources and cotton instead, building an economy around the sea rather than the soil. A completely different blueprint for building a complex society, developed with no known contact with Egypt, Mesopotamia, or other Old World civilizations. It's a reminder that monumental architecture didn't need to be imported into the Americas. Complex societies developed their own traditions of building on a massive scale. Independently, more than once, continents apart, and with no shared blueprint at all. And this is where the story stops being only about Earth and artifacts and becomes about people, their beliefs, their politics, and the choices later generations made about whose achievements were worth remembering. So why did most Americans never learn any of this? Not because the evidence was hidden. The mounds were never buried. 19th century settlers rode past them in plain sight for generations, farmed around them, sometimes plowed straight through them. The real block was a story people preferred to believe. A vanished mound builder race, imagined as Vikings, or a lost tribe of Israel, or almost anyone except the ancestors of the indigenous nations still living nearby. Accrediting Native Americans with monumental engineering complicated the era's justification for taking their land, so the myth was more comfortable than the truth. It took the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology, starting in the 1880s, to formally trace the mounds back to indigenous builders, now the firm's scholarly consensus. The myth lingered in popular culture for generations after the evidence was settled, and traces of it still surface today. Here's the twist worth sitting with. This hidden history was never actually hidden. What was missing wasn't data, it was a willingness to look at it honestly. And that's not even the last correction to this story. The old land bridge theory assumed a single migration, one wave of hunters chasing mammoths across an ice-free corridor around 13,000 years ago. But those footprints at White Sands, combined with sites like Monte Verde in Chile, dated to at least 14,500 years ago, far south of where a land bridge migration should have reached that early, now point to something messier. Multiple waves, some possibly by boat along the Pacific coast, arriving thousands of years earlier than anyone assumed a generation ago. Every new discovery seems to push the timeline further back, not forward, which raises an unsettling question of its own. How much of this story is still missing? Step back, and this stops being a story about mounds and footprints. It's a story about how civilizations get remembered, or written out. The Mississippian mound builders never knew Sumer existed. Sumer never knew they existed either. Yet, without contact, without comparison, something in human nature reached toward the same monuments, the same calendars, the same ambitions, again and again, on opposite sides of the planet. That convergence, quiet as it is, and may be one of the most astonishing facts in all of archaeology. Proof that the drive to build something permanent isn't the property of any one culture, but something closer to a universal human instinct. Today, and Monk's Mound still rises above the Illinois floodplain, mowed grass standing where a city's plaza once stood. Most drivers on the interstate beside it have no idea what they're passing. But the footprints at White Sands are still being studied, still pushing this continent's story further back than anyone predicted, and there's no reason to think the last correction has been made. Somewhere beneath a cornfield, a forest, or a quiet backyard, the next chapter of America, before America may already be waiting. Not lost, just not yet asked about.